The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and nobody thought anything could destroy it because 17 different alien species had joined together and promised to protect each other and their combined military forces. Numbered in the tens of thousands of ships, and everyone believed they were safe and strong and untouchable in their power across 400 star systems. Captain Daniel Parker stood on the bridge of the UNS Valiant and watched the view screens display the vast emptiness of space around them, and he was 42 years old and had spent half his life among the stars, and the Valiant was humanity's newest fleet carrier and stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern and bristled with weapons and fighter bays that made other species nervous because humans built their ships for war, while the Council species built theirs for peace. Humanity had only joined the Council 30 years ago after they helped fight off some pirates who were attacking a mining colony, and the Council let them in because humans proved they could fight, but most of the older species still looked down on them and called them primitives who got lucky with faster-than-light travel, and treated them like children who did not understand how civilized species behaved. Lieutenant Commander Helen Brooks served as second in command of the Valiant, and she had tried many times to convince the Council military leaders that their defensive strategies were outdated and weak, but they just smiled at her like she was a child throwing a tantrum and told her that they had been keeping peace for thousands of years, while humanity was still living in caves and learning to make fire. The warning came without much fanfare on what Earth calendars called a Tuesday, and the long-range sensors picked up something strange moving in from the edge of the galaxy, and at first nobody knew what to make of it because the readings showed thousands of ships moving in perfect formation like a school of fish, and they came from a direction where nothing was supposed to exist. Within 6 hours, the border colony stopped sending messages, and there were no distress calls or emergency broadcasts, and the systems just went silent like someone had flipped a switch and turned them off, and the Council finally realized something terrible was happening, and they called an emergency meeting for the first time in 1,000 years. The enemy became known as the Devourers, and nobody knew where they came from or what they wanted, but they destroyed everything in their path and left nothing behind except empty space and debris, and the Council scrambled to organize their fleets and prepare for a war they had forgotten how to fight. Admiral Gregory Stone commanded the Council Defense Forces from a massive space station called Barrier 7, and he tried to coordinate 17 different alien species, who all had different ideas about how to fight and different weapons and different tactics, and none of them had fought a real war in centuries because all they knew was chasing pirates and breaking up smuggling rings. The Valiant received orders to join something called the 3rd Defense Fleet, and Captain Parker brought his ship to the gathering point near the Cronus Belt, and the view screens filled with thousands of alien warships of every shape and size imaginable. And it should have been impressive, but something felt wrong to Parker, and he could not shake the feeling that they were all heading toward disaster. Commander Brooks studied the fleet formations and did not like what she saw, because the Council ships were arranging themselves in pretty patterns that followed traditions going back thousands of years, and when she suggested different deployments, based on human naval history, a Thalan commander who was 300 years old told her to be quiet and let the experienced officers handle things. The Devourers hit the 3rd Fleet like a hammer smashing glass, and their ships moved with coordination that seemed impossible, and they targeted the command vessels first, and then systematically tore apart the confused defenders who tried to fight back but could not adapt fast enough, and within hours the battle turned into a massacre. Council ships fought bravely and their crews died at their stations, but their weapons were designed for precision strikes against small targets, and the Devourers came in waves that overwhelmed every defense, and 7,000 ships were destroyed or crippled in the first 6 hours, and the survivors scattered in panic across a dozen star systems. The Valiant survived because Captain Parker ignored the formation orders and maneuvered his ship independently and used the carrier's point defense systems to shoot down incoming missiles and fighters, and when the fleet coordinator ordered him to hold position, Parker pretended the communication system was damaged and kept moving. Lieutenant Jake Morris commanded the fighter wing aboard the Valiant, and his 200 pilots flew missions that would have been considered reckless by Council standards, but they survived when others died because they used asteroids for cover and mined debris fields and coordinated their attacks in ways that confused the enemy and made them hesitate. As the remains of the 3rd Fleet retreated in disorder, a new message came through the emergency channels, and it made everyone's blood run cold, because this had only been the Devourer scouting force, and the main invasion fleet was still coming. and intelligence reports said it numbered in the hundreds of thousands of ships. Captain Parker brought the Valiant to a fortress world called Sentinel Prime, where the survivors were gathering and trying to figure out what to do next, and the shipyards worked day and night trying to repair damaged vessels, while council leaders argued about whether to make a stand or retreat deeper into their territory. The council's supreme admiral was a Thalen named Vexer, who had commanded fleets for 200 years, and he called a strategy meeting with hundreds of officers crowded into a conference room, and Captain Parker attended even though he was one of only 3 humans present and felt like an outsider among aliens who still did not respect his species. Admiral Vexer presented his plan with confidence and ceremony, and it involved deploying the remaining fleets in layered defensive shells around Sentinel Prime, and everyone nodded and agreed, except Commander Brooks, who quietly told Captain Parker that this was the same strategy that had failed at Cronus just on a bigger scale. Captain Parker requested a private meeting with Admiral Vexer, and brought detailed analysis from the Valiant's computers and proposed a different approach based on human history, and suggested using carriers for mobile warfare and hit-and-run tactics instead of static defense, but the Admiral listened politely, then dismissed everything Parker said because humanity had barely been in space for a century, while the Council had been fighting wars since before humans existed. The Battle of Sentinel Prime lasted 4 days, and 12,000 Council ships fought against an enemy that seemed endless, and for a brief moment it looked like they might actually hold the line and push back the Devourers. But then the main enemy fleet arrived and blotted out the stars with their numbers, and what followed was not really a battle but an execution. Admiral Vexer died when his flagship exploded and took 3 enemy cruisers with it, and his death broke the command structure and the fleet fell apart, and ships fled in every direction toward their home systems and abandoned any pretense of coordination or unity. Captain Parker received the retreat order and made a decision that surprised everyone on his bridge because instead of running toward Earth, he ordered the Valiant to hide in the shadow of a gas giant and stay to watch the enemy and learn their patterns and gather intelligence that might help humanity survive what was coming, even if it meant risking his ship and crew in the process. The Valiant stayed hidden in the shadow of a massive gas giant for 6 days, while the crew operated on minimal power and spoke in whispers, even though sound could not travel through the vacuum of space, and everyone watched their sensors as the Devourer fleet methodically destroyed everything the Council had built around Sentinel Prime. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell commanded the sensor array, and she had been a data analyst before joining the Navy, so she treated the enemy fleet like a puzzle that could be solved with enough information, and she cataloged every movement and every formation and every attack pattern, and slowly, the data began revealing secrets that nobody else had noticed. The Devourers moved in groups of exactly 17 ships, and they always maintained specific geometric formations, and their attack sequences followed predictable rotations, and they communicated using low-frequency pulses that human sensors could barely detect, and Mitchell realized they were not really thousands of independent ships, but more like a single organism with many parts working together. Captain Parker studied Mitchell's reports in his ready room and saw patterns that the more advanced Council species had somehow missed, and he understood that if you could disrupt the coordination between Devourer ships, you might be able to disrupt their entire fleet and turn their strength into a weakness. Commander Brooks coordinated with the department heads to prepare for whatever came next, and Chief Engineer Raymond Blake reported that the fusion cores were running at 40% efficiency to minimize their energy signature, and they had maybe 2 weeks of supplies left if they continued rationing everything. And the question was not if they would have to move, but when and where they would go. On the 7th day, the Devourer fleet began splitting into smaller groups, and each group headed toward different Council systems, and Lieutenant Mitchell tracked over 40 separate task forces, and each one contained hundreds of ships, and they were spreading out like a disease to consume everything the Council had built over thousands of years. Captain Parker called his senior officers to the briefing room, and they crowded around the holographic display that showed the projected enemy movements, painting a picture of civilization's extinction. And within 3 months, every major Council world would face invasion, and Earth's turn would come in approximately 70 days. Lieutenant Commander Kyle Peterson commanded the ship's 200 Marines, and he asked what everyone was thinking, which was what could one carrier possibly do against a fleet that had just destroyed 12,000 warships, and the question hung in the air like a weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. Parker's answer was simple and direct, and he said they could not fight the Devourer fleet head-on, but they could make the enemy bleed, and humanity had perfected asymmetric warfare across centuries of conflict, and every military tradition from guerrilla fighters to submarine warfare taught the same lesson, which was that a weaker force could defeat a stronger one through intelligence and mobility and calculated risks. The plan was crazy enough that it might actually work, and the Valiant would shadow one of the smaller Devourer task forces and identify their logistics vessels and strike their supply lines and starve the beast rather than fighting it directly, and use the carrier's fighters for hit-and-run attacks and never stay in one location long enough for the enemy to concentrate their forces. Commander Brooks pointed out all the obvious flaws in this plan and said they had no intelligence on Devourer logistics and no idea if the enemy even needed supplies in the traditional sense, and they would be one ship against hundreds with no support and no resupply and no hope of reinforcement, and if they were discovered, they would be destroyed within minutes. Parker acknowledged every concern and then asked his officers a single question, which was, did anyone have a better idea? And the silence that followed was answer enough because they could run for Earth and arrive just in time to watch it burn. Or they could stay and fight and buy time for someone somewhere to find a solution to this nightmare. The vote was unanimous, and even Commander Brooks, who was always cautious, agreed that doing something beat accepting inevitable defeat, and Lieutenant Morris and his pilots practically cheered at the prospect of taking the fight to the enemy, and Chief Blake promised to keep the ship running on nothing but spite and ingenuity, if that was what it took. The Valiant broke from its hiding place and began stalking a Devourer task force, heading toward the industrial systems of the Caldari sector, and 300 enemy ships moved in perfect formation, expecting no resistance, and completely unaware that humanity's way of warfare was about to introduce itself to the galaxy in the most violent way possible. For the first week, they simply observed and learned patterns and identified targets, and Lieutenant Mitchell's analysis proved accurate, because every task force included support vessels that were slower craft that hung back during battles and then moved forward to process debris, and the Devourers were recycling destroyed ships and using the raw materials to build more vessels, which was elegant and efficient, but also revealed a crucial weakness. The first strike came on day 14, when Lieutenant Morris led 60 fighters against an isolated support vessel that was processing the remains of a destroyed Council space station, and the attack lasted exactly 4 minutes, and human missiles overwhelmed the target's defenses, and it exploded in a brilliant fireball that was visible across the entire system, and the fighters scattered before nearby Devourer warships could respond, and vanished into an asteroid belt where the enemy's superior numbers meant absolutely nothing. The Devourer task force reacted with confusion, and their perfect formations fell apart as ships turned to hunt for attackers who were already gone, and they searched for 3 days and found nothing but empty space and the cold wreckage of their support vessel floating among the stars. Captain Parker watched the enemy's frustration from 100 million kilometers away, and he smiled because the Council had tried to fight the Devourers as a conventional fleet, meeting them in open battle and following traditional rules of engagement. But humanity was about to teach the galaxy how an underdog fights back when survival is the only thing that matters. Over the next 3 weeks, the Valiant became a nightmare for the Devourers, and supply convoys disappeared without warning, and support vessels exploded in sudden attacks, and mining operations found themselves under assault from fighters that appeared from nowhere and struck with devastating precision, and vanished before any response could be mounted. Lieutenant Morris and his pilots developed tactics that would have made Council commanders faint with horror, and they used debris fields as launch points and hid among comet tails, and once even attached themselves magnetically to the hull of a Devourer capital ship, and rode it for 6 hours before launching a point-blank assault on its escorts. The killboard in the pilot's ready room grew longer each week, and hash marks representing enemy vessels destroyed covered the wall, and the pilots competed to see who could score the most kills, and morale stayed high, despite the constant danger and the knowledge that any mission could be their last. But the enemy was learning and adapting, and the Devourers began changing their formations and dedicated escort vessels to protect their logistics, and started hunting the Valiant with systematic determination, and what had started as confusion evolved into a coordinated search pattern that grew more sophisticated with each encounter. Captain Parker pushed his crew harder than anyone had a right to ask, and Chief Blake and his engineering teams worked miracles keeping the fusion cores running despite missing resupply for over 4 weeks. and the ship's fabricators cannibalized, destroyed equipment to manufacture spare parts, and they rationed food and water and even air, and ran life support systems at minimum safe levels. Commander Brooks managed the impossible task of keeping morale up, while everyone operated under constant stress, and she organized movie nights in the rec room and talent shows, and even a ship-wide poker tournament, and these small moments of normalcy reminded everyone why they were fighting and what they were trying to protect. The intelligence Lieutenant Mitchell gathered proved invaluable, not just for the Valiant but for the broader war effort, and the ship maintained sporadic contact with Council remnant forces and transmitted tactical data on Devourer weaknesses and patterns, and other surviving ships began attempting similar tactics with varying degrees of success, and humanity's carrier warfare doctrine was spreading through the scattered defenders, offering hope where before there had been only despair. Earth's Defense Command promoted Captain Parker to Admiral, even though he was too far away to receive the promotion in person, and it was purely symbolic, because everyone knew Earth might not survive long enough to honor its heroes properly. But the crew celebrated anyway because their captain had earned the recognition through blood and fire, and months of fighting impossible odds. The turning point came during an operation in the Vardis system, when the Valiant tracked a major Devourer logistics hub that was built inside a converted asteroid and processed captured materials into new warships, and it was too tempting a target to ignore, even though Commander Brooks warned that anything this important would obviously be heavily defended. Admiral Parker authorized the strike anyway and committed the entire fighter wing and half the ship's missile reserves to the attack, and Lieutenant Morris led 200 fighters screaming out of the darkness in the largest single assault the Valiant had attempted since the war began, and everyone on the ship held their breath and watched the tactical displays. They flew straight into a trap because the moment the fighters committed, over 50 Devourer warships emerged from concealment around the asteroid, and they had been waiting and watching and learning human tactics, and now they would teach the humans a lesson about overconfidence. What followed was a desperate running battle through the asteroid belt, and human pilots fought with everything they had learned over months of combat and used every trick and tactic they knew. But the numbers were simply overwhelming, and ships exploded one after another, and voices screamed over the communication channels and then went silent forever. Lieutenant Morris saw what was happening and made the hardest decision of his life, and ordered half the wing to break off and return to the Valiant, while he and 50 volunteers stayed behind to hold the enemy's attention and buy time for their brothers and sisters to escape. Admiral Parker watched the tactical display as his fighters died one by one, and each loss was a name he knew, and a face he recognized, and a person who had trusted him to bring them home. And Lieutenant Commander Peterson volunteered to take a combat shuttle and extract the survivors, but there was no way to reach them in time, because the Devourers were closing in for the kill. The decision Parker made in that moment would define him forever as a commander, and instead of abandoning the fighters to save his ship, he ordered the Valiant forward at maximum acceleration directly toward the enemy fleet, and every weapon system came online, and Chief Blake pushed the fusion cores past their safety limits, and the entire ship shuddered as it hurled itself into battle. The Valiant emerged from the asteroid belt like an ancient warship of legend with all weapons blazing, and its point defense lasers created a web of destruction that swatted Devourer fighters from space like insects, and missiles launched in waves, and each one found targets with the precision that came from months of tactical data, and the carrier's main railguns that were normally used for orbital bombardment fired at enemy capital ships with devastating effect. The attack was suicide, and everyone on the bridge knew it. But they executed their duties with calm professionalism, and Commander Brooks coordinated damage control as enemy fire hammered their shields and consoles exploded and filled the bridge with smoke and sparks, and Lieutenant Mitchell called out targeting solutions even as her station caught fire, and the ship bucked and rolled under the impact of enemy weapons. The Valiant was dying, and everyone knew it, but they would die fighting, and they would die saving their people. And that had to be enough, because there was nothing else they could do and nowhere else they could go, and this was where they would make their stand. Then something unexpected happened that nobody could have predicted, and the Devourer fleet hesitated. And for the first time since the war began, they encountered something that contradicted their understanding of warfare and confused their collective consciousness. A single ship that was impossibly outnumbered charged directly into battle, not to destroy the enemy fleet but to save a handful of small craft, and the action made no tactical sense and violated every principle of self-preservation, and it completely disrupted the Devourer attack patterns because they could not understand why anyone would sacrifice so much for so little. In that moment of confusion, Lieutenant Morris rallied his surviving fighters and broke through the enemy perimeter, and 37 pilots made it back to the Valiant's flight deck and landed their damaged craft even as the carrier's guns continued firing at everything in range. The moment the last fighter touched down, Admiral Parker ordered emergency jump, and the ship's faster-than-light drive engaged, and they vanished from normal space, leaving the bewildered Devourer fleet behind, still trying to understand what had just happened. The Valiant emerged in an empty system 3 light-years away, with systems failing and hull breached in a dozen places but somehow still alive, and the crew celebrated their survival, even as repair teams rushed to seal the damage and restore basic functions. They had lost 63 pilots in the battle, and it was the worst single-day casualties since the campaign began, and the empty bunks in the pilot quarters felt like open wounds, and the survivors dealt with their grief in different ways, and some cried and some got angry, and some just went numb. But they had also proven something incredibly important that would change everything going forward. And Admiral Parker understood it even if he could not quite put it into words yet. And the Devourers could be surprised, and they could hesitate, and they could be made to doubt their own tactics, and if they could doubt, then maybe they could be defeated. Chief Blake's engineering teams worked around the clock for 3 weeks conducting repairs with dwindling resources, and they performed miracles with spare parts and improvisation, but some damage simply could not be fixed without a proper shipyard, and the carrier's port flight deck remained depressurized, and 2 of its 4 fusion cores operated at reduced capacity. The ship was held together by determination and welding and prayers, and it limped through empty space while Admiral Parker received sporadic transmissions from scattered Council forces, and the news was universally grim because 40 systems had fallen completely, and 17 Council species faced extinction, and Earth's defensive fleets were gathering for a last stand, but projections gave them less than 30 days before the Devourers arrived. Then Lieutenant Mitchell detected something unusual on the long-range sensors, and it was a signal that was faint but unmistakably artificial, and it came from the edge of explored space. And when she analyzed it, she discovered it was an old Council emergency beacon like the kind used by deep space research stations, and the timestamp indicated it had been broadcasting for over 6 months, which meant it predated the Devourer invasion by 3 months. Commander Brooks argued strongly against investigating, because they were barely operational and low on supplies, and every day brought the enemy closer to Earth, and whatever that signal was, it could not possibly be more important than getting home and defending their planet. But Admiral Parker saw something in the data that troubled him, and he could not ignore it because the beacon's location corresponded with a Council archaeological expedition, and researchers had been studying ancient ruins on a dead world, and if there was even the smallest chance they had discovered something relevant, then it was worth the detour. Against his executive officer's advice, Parker ordered a course change, and the Valiant altered direction and headed toward the signal, because they were in no condition for another fight anyway, and they needed time to repair, and an abandoned system was as safe a place as any to catch their breath. The planet was designated Research Station Omega-7, and it was a cold world orbiting a dying red star, and the station itself was intact, but running on emergency power only, and the Valiant approached cautiously with sensors sweeping for any sign of Devourer presence, but the system appeared completely abandoned. Lieutenant Commander Peterson led a Marine boarding team to the research station, and they moved through the corridors with weapons ready, expecting trouble, but finding only silence, and the emergency lights cast everything in a dim red glow that made shadows dance on the walls. What they found chilled them to the core because the research team was dead, but not from violence or combat, and they had died at their workstations apparently from exhaustion, and they were still slumped over their computers and consoles as if they had simply worked until their bodies gave out. The station's main computer contained months of research data, and all of it focused on ruins that predated any known Council civilization, and the archaeologists had been excited about their discoveries based on the personal logs they had recorded, and they believed they had found something incredibly important. The lead researcher had left a final message recorded just hours before his death, and his name was Dr. Simon Grant, and he was a human xenoarchaeologist who had spent 20 years studying ancient galactic civilizations, and his words were delivered with the calm certainty of someone who knew he would not survive to see his discovery's impact. Dr. Grant explained that the ruins on Omega-7 were not built by any council species, but by a civilization that had existed millions of years ago, and they had spanned the entire galaxy and built incredible structures and achieved things that modern science could barely understand. His team had translated portions of the ancient records, and the story they told was terrifyingly familiar, because the ancient civilization had fallen to an enemy that consumed everything in its path and adapted and evolved and could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional warfare. The Devourers were not a new threat, but an old one returning after millions of years in some kind of dormancy, and the ancient civilization had fought them to a stalemate with neither side capable of destroying the other, and eventually they had found a different solution that was not victory but containment. The specifics were fragmentary and incomplete, but Dr. Grant believed he had found the location of the ancient civilization's final weapon, and it was a device designed specifically to counter the Devourers, and the coordinates pointed to a system deep in uncharted space beyond the galactic rim where the Devourers had first emerged. It would take the Valiant 2 weeks to reach those coordinates, and that meant 2 weeks during which Earth's defenses might crumble and humanity might face extinction. And Commander Brooks made her position absolutely clear that they should transmit the data to Earth and let someone else investigate while the Valiant returned home. Admiral Parker called together his senior staff and laid out the choice they faced, and it was not an easy one, because they could go home and add one carrier to Earth's defense and probably die with their planet, or they could chase what might be humanity's only chance at survival and abandon Earth in its darkest hour for a desperate gamble based on million-year-old data from a dead civilization. The vote was closer than Parker had expected, and half the senior staff voted to return home because they were unwilling to abandon their families and homeworld, and the other half voted to continue because they believed the potential weapon was worth any sacrifice, and Parker cast the deciding vote and said they would proceed to the coordinates. The journey to the galactic rim was the longest of their lives, and the crew was divided down the middle, with some believing their captain had made the right choice, and others convinced they were chasing ghosts while Earth burned and morale plummeted despite Commander Brooks' best efforts. Fights broke out in the corridors between crew members who disagreed about the decision, and Admiral Parker had to confine several people to quarters to maintain discipline, and the tension on the ship was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone felt it pressing down on them. Lieutenant Mitchell worked obsessively on the ancient data and tried to prepare for whatever they might find, and the fragments spoke of something called a harmonization field that disrupted the Devourers' collective consciousness and forced each ship to operate independently and without coordination. They became vulnerable and confused and capable of being defeated one at a time. The Valiant emerged from faster-than-light travel at the coordinates and found a sight that defied all comprehension and made everyone on the bridge stop and stare in wonder and fear, because what they saw should not have been possible. A megastructure orbited a black hole, and it was a ring the size of an entire solar system, and it was still active after millions of years and still glowing with power, and it was beautiful and terrible all at once, and it was a monument to a civilization that had mastered physics in ways the Council had never dreamed, and it was guarded because the structure was not abandoned, and thousands of Devourer ships orbited it in perfect formation as if they had been waiting and knew that eventually someone would come seeking it, and they had positioned themselves to prevent anyone from reaching it. Admiral Parker stared at the impossible odds displayed on his tactical screens and began to laugh because it was so absurd and so tragic and somehow perfectly appropriate that they had come all this way and abandoned Earth and divided his crew, only to find humanity's potential salvation defended by the very enemy they hoped to defeat. Then Lieutenant Morris appeared on the bridge still wearing his flight suit, and he was followed by every combat-ready pilot on the ship, and they had come to volunteer for one final strike, because if that structure was the key to defeating the Devourers, then someone had to activate it, and they would hold the enemy off long enough for it to happen. Chief Blake and his engineers volunteered to take a shuttle to the structure, because they believed they could interface with the ancient technology, and Lieutenant Commander Peterson and his Marines said they would go with the engineers and buy them time if the Devourers tried to board, and Lieutenant Mitchell would guide them remotely and translate the ancient data in real time. Commander Brooks looked at Admiral Parker and saw the weight of command finally breaking him, because he had asked so much from his crew, And now he was asking for everything, and she stepped forward and took his hand and spoke loud enough for everyone on the bridge to hear. She said they had come too far to hesitate now, and the Valiant had stood alone when fleets fell, and its crew had fought impossible odds and survived, and now they would make one final stand, not for glory or recognition, but because someone had to, and there was no one else left to do it. Admiral Daniel Parker looked at the faces around him and saw determination and fear and courage all mixed together, and he gave the order to commence the attack, and the UNS Valiant, battered and undermanned and impossibly outgunned, charged toward the megastructure and its destiny. Behind them, Earth fought for survival, and ahead of them, an ancient weapon waited to be awakened, and around them the Devourers gathered for what they believed would be an easy kill, and they were about to learn that humanity did not need fleets to win wars. The final battle began with the Valiant launching every fighter it had left, and Lieutenant Morris led them forward in a spearhead formation that drove straight toward the megastructure and ignored the Devourer ships that moved to intercept them. Chief Blake's shuttle followed close behind the fighters, using them as cover, and inside the shuttle the engineers checked their equipment one last time, and the Marines loaded their weapons, and Lieutenant Mitchell transmitted guidance from the Valiant's bridge, and her voice was calm and steady as she directed them toward an access port on the ancient structure. The Devourers reacted exactly as expected and threw everything they had at the attackers, and the fighters scattered and regrouped and scattered again, and used every tactic humanity had developed over months of desperate combat, and they died in ones and twos, but they kept fighting. The shuttle reached the structure and locked onto the access port, and Chief Blake and his team went inside while Peterson's Marines set up a defensive perimeter, and the ancient corridors glowed with a soft blue light that had been waiting millions of years for someone to return. Chief Blake stood in the control room of the ancient structure and stared at technology that was millions of years old but still functioned perfectly, and the walls glowed with symbols and displays that shifted and changed and responded to his presence, as if the structure itself was alive and aware. Lieutenant Mitchell's voice came through his communication device, and she was translating the ancient language in real time and guiding him through the activation sequence step by step, and her voice remained calm, even though everyone knew the Devourers were closing in. Outside the structure, the battle raged with desperate intensity, and Lieutenant Morris and his remaining pilots fought like demons and threw their fighters at the enemy with reckless abandon, and they died one after another, but each death bought a few more seconds for the engineers inside. Admiral Parker watched from the Valiant's bridge as his tactical display showed friendly contacts winking out of existence, and each one represented a person he knew and had served with, and he felt every loss like a physical blow. But he could not look away because they deserved to be witnessed in their final moments. Commander Brooks coordinated the Valiant's fire support, and the carrier poured everything it had into the enemy formations and tried to draw attention away from the fighters and the shuttle, and the ship shook under repeated impacts, and damage reports flooded in from every section. The main view screen showed the megastructure beginning to glow brighter, and energy patterns rippled across its surface like waves on water, and Chief Blake's voice came over the communication channel and said he had found the activation controls and was initiating the sequence, but it would take time to power up after millions of years of dormancy. Lieutenant Commander Peterson and his Marines held the corridor leading to the control room, and Devourer boarding craft had attached to the structure, and enemy soldiers were cutting through the hull, and the Marines set up defensive positions and checked their ammunition and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The first Devourers came through the breach moving with inhuman speed and coordination, and Peterson's Marines opened fire, and the corridor filled with weapons discharge and the smell of burning metal and alien blood. But for every enemy that fell, 2 more took its place. Chief Blake worked frantically at the ancient controls, and his hands moved across displays he barely understood, while Lieutenant Mitchell's voice guided him through each step, and the structure's power systems came online one by one and began building toward activation. Lieutenant Morris had only 12 fighters left when the harmonization field activated, and the effect was immediate and dramatic, and every Devourer ship in the system suddenly lost its coordination and began moving erratically like a school of fish that had lost its sense of direction. The ships that had moved as one perfect organism now operated as thousands of confused individuals, and they collided with each other and fired on their own forces and tried to retreat in different directions simultaneously, and their terrifying efficiency vanished in an instant. Admiral Parker saw the enemy formation collapse on his tactical display, and for a moment, he could not believe what he was seeing. And then Commander Brooks shouted that it was working, and the harmonization field was disrupting the Devourer collective consciousness exactly as the ancient records had predicted. The Valiant and its surviving fighters fell on the confused enemy like wolves on scattered sheep, and they tore through Devourer ships that no longer knew how to coordinate their defenses, and within minutes the battle turned from a desperate last stand into a slaughter. But inside the structure the situation remained desperate, because the Devourer's boarding party had broken through the marine perimeter, and Lieutenant Commander Peterson fell with enemy fire burning through his armor, and his Marines fell around him one by one until only a handful remained between the enemy and the control room. Chief Blake heard the weapons fire getting closer, and knew he had only minutes left, and he looked at the activation sequence on the ancient display and saw that the field was operating at only partial power because the structure's systems were damaged and degraded after millions of years, and it would take hours to reach full strength. Lieutenant Mitchell analyzed the data streaming from the structure and realized the terrible truth, which was that the harmonization field could disrupt the Devourers in this system, but it would take time to expand its range across the galaxy, and the enemy would adapt and overcome it before that happened, unless someone found a way to boost the power output. The solution came to Blake in a flash of understanding that was part inspiration and part desperation, and he realized the structure was designed to draw power from the black hole it orbited, but the systems that channeled that power were failing and needed to be bypassed, and he could do it, but it would require manually overriding the safety protocols. Blake told Admiral Parker what he intended to do, and explained that overriding the safeties would cause a feedback loop that would destroy the structure and everyone inside it, but it would also amplify the harmonization field across the entire galaxy, instantly and permanently disrupt the Devourer collective consciousness. Admiral Parker tried to order Blake to abandon the plan and return to the shuttle, but the engineer cut off the transmission and sealed the control room door and began the override sequence while the last Marines died in the corridor outside, fighting to buy him the final seconds he needed. The Valiant sensors detected massive energy buildup in the megastructure, and Admiral Parker understood what was happening and ordered all surviving fighters to return immediately, and the carrier began accelerating away from the structure at maximum speed. Lieutenant Morris brought his last 8 fighters home, and they landed on the flight deck with seconds to spare, and the Valiant jumped to faster-than-light travel just as the megastructure reached critical energy levels. The explosion was visible. Across half the galaxy, and the harmonization field expanded in all directions at faster-than-light speed, and swept across every system where Devourers fought and disrupted their coordination permanently and irreversibly. Devourer fleets that had seemed unstoppable suddenly became confused mobs, and council forces that had been retreating in despair rallied and counterattacked, and within days, the tide of war reversed completely. Earth's defense fleet was preparing for the final battle when the Devourer invasion force arrived, and suddenly lost all coordination, and the human ships tore through the confused enemy with methodical efficiency, and humanity survived. Admiral Parker brought the Valiant home 3 weeks later, and the ship was barely functional and held together with temporary repairs and improvised solutions, and less than half the crew that had left Earth remained alive. They received a hero's welcome. But Parker felt only emptiness because he thought about Chief Blake and Lieutenant Commander Peterson, and the 63 pilots lost at Vardis, and the hundreds more who had died in the months of fighting, and he wondered if victory was worth the price they had paid. Commander Brooks found him standing alone in the empty pilot ready room, staring at the names written on the killboard, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and they stood together in silence, honoring the dead. The Galactic Council reformed, and humanity took a seat among the senior members, and other species asked Admiral Parker to teach them human military doctrine and tactics, and he agreed because the galaxy had learned a hard lesson about the cost of forgetting how to fight. The Valiant received repairs and upgrades and remained in service for another 40 years, and eventually was retired and turned into a museum ship, and visitors walked its corridors and read about the crew that had stood alone when fleets fell. Admiral Daniel Parker lived to see humanity become one of the most respected military powers in the galaxy, and he trained a new generation of officers and taught them that sometimes victory requires sacrifice, and that one ship with a determined crew can change the course of history. But he never forgot those months when the Valiant fought alone, and he visited the memorial wall every year on the anniversary of the Battle of Vardis, and read the names of those who gave everything so that others might live. And he remembered that humanity earned its place among the stars not through technology or numbers, but through courage and sacrifice and the willingness to stand when others fell.